Welcome to Empathy Stories, where we uncover heartfelt tales of courage, love, and transformation. Today, we delve into the haunting yet inspiring journey of Margaret, a housekeeper who discovers a millionaire's dark secrets and risks everything to save a young girl. Emily. From a life of fear. Let's begin. Margaret had worked in many homes over the years, but nothing compared to the grandeur of the Whittaker estate. Nestled on the outskirts of Boston, the mansion was a masterpiece of architecture. With its towering spires, expansive gardens, and gleaming marble interiors. From the moment Margaret stepped into its cold, echoing halls, she felt a strange unease. For all its grandeur, the estate lacked warmth. It was a house that seemed to thrive on silence, its beauty marred by an invisible weight hanging in the air. Margaret had been hired as a housekeeper only 2 weeks earlier. From the beginning, the rules were clear. Martha, the stern head of staff, had given her a brisk tour of the house, ending it with a warning. Mr. Robert Whittaker is a man of high expectations. Do your job. Stay out of family matters, and you'll do just fine, she said, her tone leaving no room for discussion. Margaret took the advice to heart, keeping her head down as she meticulously cleaned the pristine halls. Yet, she couldn't help but notice the peculiar atmosphere in the house. The other staff members were efficient but distant, avoiding eye contact and speaking only when absolutely necessary. The family portraits that adorned the walls were equally unsettling. Robert Whittaker, his wife Catherine, and their 2 children, Ryan and Emily, were captured in perfect stillness, their expressions cold and detached. But it was Emily's face that lingered in Margaret's mind. The young girl's eyes seemed hollow, staring into the distance as if burdened by a weight far too heavy for a child. Margaret first encountered Emily one afternoon while cleaning the second-floor hallway. The girl sat by a large bay window, her small frame curled into the seat, gazing out at the sprawling garden. She didn't speak, nor did she acknowledge Margaret's presence. Her shoulders were slumped, and her hands clutched a worn notebook to her chest. Margaret offered her a soft smile, but Emily didn't respond. That evening, Margaret overheard a hushed conversation between Martha and another staff member. "That poor child," Martha said, her voice heavy with pity. "She spends all her time alone. Her mother's too busy with her events. And her father, well, we all know how he is." "What about her brother?" the other staff member asked quietly. "Ryan's at school most of the time," Martha replied. "Emily has no one. She's just a little girl. But the things she's been through, no child should suffer like that." Margaret's heart sank as she listened. The words confirmed what she had already begun to suspect: there was something deeply wrong within the Whittaker family. Later that night, Margaret lay in her small room at the back of the mansion, unable to sleep. The house was silent, the kind of oppressive silence that only added to her unease. As she turned over in bed, she heard it, a faint, muffled sound coming from upstairs. She strained her ears, and her heart tightened when she realized what it was: the sound of a child crying. It didn't take long to determine where the cries were coming from. Margaret followed the sound to Emily's room, her footsteps careful and quiet. The soft sobs on the other side of the door were gut-wrenching, filled with desperation. For a moment, Margaret hesitated. She had been warned to stay out of family matters. But as she stood there, listening to the pain in Emily's voice, her conscience refused to let her walk away. She gently knocked on the door, but there was no answer. Summoning her courage, Margaret opened it slowly and stepped inside. Emily was sitting on the floor, her back to the door, staring out of the window with tears streaming down her face. She clutched her notebook tightly, as though it were her only source of comfort. "Emily," Margaret said softly, her voice kind and soothing. "Are you all right?" Emily didn't respond. She remained still, her small frame tense, her tears silently falling. Margaret knelt beside her, careful not to intrude too much into her space. "I'm here to help," she whispered. "If you ever need someone to talk to, you can talk to me." Emily finally turned her head, her tear-streaked face breaking Margaret's heart. Her eyes, hollow and distant, were filled with a fear Margaret had never seen in a child before. It wasn't the fear of a bad dream or a scraped knee, it was the fear of something darker, something that had been festering for years. Margaret stayed with Emily until the girl's tears subsided, offering quiet reassurances. Though Emily didn't speak, her brief glances at Margaret carried a silent plea for help. As Margaret left the room that night, she made a quiet promise to herself. She didn't know what was happening in the Whittaker household, but she would find out. Emily's pain was too raw, too real, to ignore. What Margaret didn't yet realize was that this decision would not only change Emily's life but her own as well. She was stepping into a storm far more dangerous than she could have imagined. But she was ready to fight. For Emily's sake. She would uncover the truth, no matter the cost. The days following Margaret's encounter with Emily were heavy with tension. Emily's cries stayed with her, haunting her thoughts as she moved through her daily tasks. The girl's pain was unmistakable, and Margaret knew she couldn't ignore it. The Whittaker mansion, with all its grandeur, now felt more like a prison, the place where secrets were buried beneath the polished floors and pristine walls. Margaret began to observe more closely, noticing the cracks in the family's carefully constructed facade. Catherine Whittaker, Emily's mother, was rarely home, spending her days at social events and charity galas. Robert Whittaker, on the other hand, was an imposing figure, his presence dominating the household. He was a man who demanded obedience, and his cold, authoritative demeanor left no room for warmth or affection. The staff moved quietly around him, avoiding his gaze and speaking in whispers. It wasn't long before Margaret found an unexpected ally in Ryan, Robert's son. Ryan was rarely at the mansion, as he attended university out of state. But when he returned for a visit, Margaret noticed a different side to him. He wasn't like his father, his eyes held a softness. And his interactions with Emily, though brief, were filled with genuine care. One evening, as Margaret was tidying the library, she overheard a heated argument between Ryan and his father. "She's just a child," Ryan's voice echoed through the hall. "You can't keep treating her like this. Don't tell me how to raise my family." Robert shot back, his tone icy. "You have no idea what it takes to keep this house in order." Margaret's hands trembled as she listened, her suspicion about Robert's treatment of Emily solidifying into certainty. That night, she decided to speak with Ryan. "Mr. Ryan," she said hesitantly, finding him in the garden later that evening. "May I have a word?" Ryan looked up, his expression weary. "Of course." "Margaret." "What is it?" Margaret hesitated, unsure of how much to reveal. "I've noticed Emily's struggles," she said carefully. "She seems very afraid. I want to help, but I don't know how." Ryan's face darkened, his jaw tightening. "You're not wrong," he said quietly. "My father, he's controlling, manipulative. Emily's too young to fight back. And my mother, she turns a blind eye. She doesn't want to see what's happening." Margaret nodded, her resolve hardening. She needs someone to stand up for her. She can't do it alone. Ryan sighed, running a hand through his hair. I've been trying. But my father, he's powerful. He knows how to cover his tracks. If we're going to do this, we need proof. The next few days were a blur of quiet planning and careful observation. Margaret and Ryan began gathering evidence of Robert's manipulation. Margaret searched through documents in the office and overheard conversations between staff members, piecing together a clearer picture of the abuse. Meanwhile, Ryan managed to find Emily's hidden notebook, filled with heartbreaking entries that detailed how Robert forced her to write fabricated letters about her mother, all as part of his plan to maintain control over the family. Each discovery deepened Margaret's determination. Emily's pain was more than she had imagined, and the knowledge of Robert's cruelty filled her with both sorrow and anger. Finally, with enough evidence in hand, Margaret and Ryan decided it was time to take action. They contacted a journalist, someone Ryan trusted to expose the truth. The story of Robert Whittaker's abuse and financial corruption began to take shape, and Margaret could feel the tide shifting. The man who had ruled his family with fear was about to face the consequences of his actions. The night before the story broke, Margaret found Emily in her room, sitting by the window as usual. This time, though, she wasn't crying. She looked at Margaret with a mix of uncertainty and hope. Are things going to change? Emily asked softly, her voice trembling. Margaret knelt beside her, placing a gentle hand on her shoulder. Yes, Emily, she said firmly. Things are going to change. You won't have to go through this alone anymore. When the story was published, it sent shockwaves through the community. Headlines about Robert Whittaker's abusive behavior and financial crimes dominated the news. Margaret and Ryan watched as the world began to see the man behind the polished image. But their fight wasn't over yet. The legal battle for Emily's custody was just beginning. As they prepared to face Robert in court, Margaret felt a sense of resolve unlike anything she had known before. This wasn't just about exposing the truth, it was about giving Emily a chance at a life free from fear. Standing in the courtroom on the first day of the trial, Margaret watched as Emily clung to her mother's hand, her small frame trembling but her eyes filled with quiet courage. Margaret and Ryan exchanged a glance. Their determination mirrored in each other's expressions. They had come this far together, and they would see it through to the end. For Emily's sake, they would not stop until she was free. The courtroom fell silent as Emily took the stand. Her small frame seemed fragile beneath the weight of the moment, but her eyes held a quiet strength that defied her age. Margaret sat in the gallery, her heart pounding as she watched the girl she had come to care for prepare to speak her truth. The judge's voice was gentle. Emily, can you tell us about your life at home? Emily's voice wavered as she began. My dad made me write things that weren't true about my mom. He said if I didn't, she would leave me. He would come into my room at night and make me copy the same words over and over. I didn't want to, but he said I had to. I was scared. The courtroom hung on every word, the weight of her testimony sinking into the room like a heavy fog. Margaret felt tears prick her eyes as Emily spoke, her small voice carrying years of pain and fear. And how did that make you feel? The judge asked, his tone soft but steady. Emily hesitated, glancing toward Margaret and Ryan, who gave her encouraging nods. I felt trapped. Like I couldn't do anything right. Like I was never going to be free. Margaret's breath caught as Emily's words echoed through the room. She could see the anguish etched into the faces of the spectators, the journalists scribbling furiously in their notebooks. And most importantly, Catherine, Emily's mother, who sat clutching her daughter's hand with tear-streaked cheeks. Robert Whittaker, however, sat rigid in his chair, his face twisted in a mask of anger. "She's lying," he spat, standing abruptly. "This is all a scheme to take what's mine." The judge banged his gavel, his voice firm. "Mr. Whittaker, you will remain seated and silent until called upon." For the first time, Robert seemed powerless. His presence diminished in the face of the evidence and the courage of his children. Margaret watched as the carefully constructed empire of control he had built over the years began to crumble before him. When the testimonies were finished and the evidence was presented, the judge deliberated for what felt like an eternity. Margaret and Ryan sat side by side, their hands clasped tightly as they waited. Finally, the judge returned, his voice cutting through the tension in the room. "Custody of Emily Whittaker is hereby granted to her mother, Catherine Whittaker. Furthermore, Mr. Robert Whittaker will face charges for child abuse and financial corruption. The court finds sufficient evidence to proceed with criminal investigations against him." A collective sigh of relief swept through the courtroom. Margaret felt her shoulders relax for the first time in weeks. They had done it. Emily was free. After the proceedings, the family gathered in the courthouse lobby. Catherine knelt beside Emily, holding her close. "You were so brave," she whispered, her voice thick with emotion. "I'm so proud of you." Ryan placed a hand on Margaret's shoulder. "We couldn't have done this without you," he said, his voice sincere. Margaret shook her head, her own eyes misty. "It wasn't just me. It was all of us. And most of all, it was Emily." She found the strength to tell the truth. In the days that followed, the Whittaker family began to rebuild. The mansion, once a symbol of fear and control, was sold, and Catherine moved with Emily to a smaller, cozier home in the heart of Boston. Ryan, who had once felt powerless against his father, became a constant source of support for his sister and mother. Margaret, no longer just the housekeeper, became an integral part of their new life. She spent her days helping Catherine and Emily adjust to their new reality, offering love and stability in ways that transcended her role. For Emily, Margaret became a surrogate grandmother, someone she could trust and lean on as she healed from the trauma of her past. One evening, as they all sat around the dinner table in their new home, Emily looked at Margaret with a shy smile. "Thank you," she said softly. Margaret tilted her head. "For what, sweetheart?" "For not leaving me alone," Emily replied, her voice trembling slightly. "For staying when I needed you." Margaret reached across the table, taking Emily's small hand in her own. "You'll never be alone again, Emily," she said firmly. "Not as long as I'm here." The room was filled with a warmth that had been missing from their lives for so long. For the first time, Emily laughed freely, her giggles filling the air like music. Ryan joined in, his arm slung protectively around his sister's shoulders, while Catherine wiped her tears with a smile. As Margaret watched the family begin to heal, she felt a deep sense of fulfillment. The journey had been long and fraught with challenges, but it had been worth every moment. Emily was safe, loved, and surrounded by people who would never let her suffer in silence again. Margaret had come to the Whittaker mansion as an outsider, but she had found something she never expected: a family. Together, they had faced the darkness, and together, they had found the light. For Margaret, the lesson was clear: compassion, courage, and love could heal even the deepest wounds. And as she looked into Emily's bright, hopeful eyes, she knew this was just the beginning of a beautiful new chapter for them all. Thank you for joining us on this powerful journey of resilience and redemption. If Margaret and Emily's story moved you, please like, comment, And subscribe to Empathy Stories for more tales that celebrate the transformative power of kindness and courage. Share your thoughts below. What lesson resonated with you the most? Remember, even in the darkest times, empathy and bravery can bring light. Until next time, stay compassionate and keep inspiring change.